Hey guys, welcome back to the Another Excuse podcast. I'm your host, Byron Greeley, and today's guest is Kate La Trobe. Kate started her own business focusing on neurodiversity consulting and coaching. We have a fascinating conversation on a topic that I honestly don't know enough about, and I feel like I should. We talk about how she started her own business, how ADHD can be present differently in adults and children, imposter syndrome, and how it's such a common challenge for entrepreneurs, how many parents gain confidence and understanding in their child, and the future of neurodiversity and where she'd like to see how society accepts neurodiversity. It's a wide-ranging conversation. We go quite deep on the topic, and I learned a lot from this, and I hope you do too. Enjoy the show. Hey Kate, thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited to get into it all. I'm fascinated by this topic and actually don't know as much as I should. So to get us started, could you tell me what your business is and how it all works?
Amazing. Thank you for having me here. I am so excited to be here and have been looking forward to this for a while now since we first spoke. Um, a little bit about me. So my business, it is a neurodiversity consulting business as well as coaching business. So basically I coach on the one side, I coach parents and individuals, I coach children, and I also consult to schools and organizations and everything to do with neurodiversity. So that includes ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and so that's kind of what I do. It's a lot all in a small sentence.
Yeah, amazing. Wow. And how, I find that fascinating. How did you get into this profession?
Honestly, it was, and I mean, we'll talk a lot about it and find out my kind of squiggly career and how I fell into it. And it's quite characteristic of having ADHD myself. But basically, after I went to Red and Yellow to do marketing and advertising, I took a few months off to go traveling. And while I was traveling, I ended up meeting the most incredible family and started working with them with one of my really good friends and looking after their children. And while I was with them, the twins ended up getting diagnosed with autism. And I just fell in love with everything to do with autism. So went back, I mean, my undergrad, I did politics, philosophy, and economics. I did marketing and advertising. And then I went back and got my master's in behavioral science. And all because of these incredible little humans that honestly, they just changed my life. So I fell in love with everything to do with autism, got into the field of neurodiversity, specifically with children and autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and started working in clinics across London, worked with the twins for quite a while, and then started coaching parents. And that's kind of how I landed in the field. So just by chance, didn't plan it.
That's a really cool story. I actually worked with children too when I went to teach English in Hong Kong. And I also learned a lot about children then. Obviously not as much as you, but I found it so fascinating, just how much they actually take in and understand at like such a young age, and what they're actually capable of. Because I feel like in South Africa, I feel like maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. I think it's up for debate, but we aren't pushed as much as like young children. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum in Hong Kong, I couldn't believe like how hard these children were pushed at times, and they were capable of doing so much at such a young age. So yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a tangent, but I just find the children and the mind
No,
so fascinating too.
I love a tangent. And I always say to any parent or teacher that I work with, or actually anyone that asks me about working with children, is seeing the world through a child's eyes is just incredible because they have so much curiosity and wonder. And it's almost like you seeing this beautiful world before it's kind of been tainted. And then seeing the world through a neurodivergent child's mind and their eyes is like on a whole different level because they see the world so differently and their minds are so beautiful and different. But unfortunately, it comes with a lot of challenges too, because the world's just not set up for differences. And I'm sure we'll get into that quite a while, like quite a bit as we go on. But yeah, that is, I guess, why I'm so passionate about what I do. Is I just want to create these inclusive spaces so these children, their strengths can shine and everything can come out as
Yeah,
it's meant to.
I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, we definitely will get into it. So you worked a few jobs before starting your own, as you said, but what made you decide to actually go out and start your own thing?
So it's so funny because I've actually said since about, like when you're younger and everyone asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, I don't care what I am when I grow up. I just want to be my own boss. And I've said that from such a young age. And so I always knew I wanted to start my own business. I just didn't know what I wanted to do or what it was going to look like. And then at the end of last year, I'd come out quite a tricky patch. I had finished my master's, so I studied my master's while working full time and finished my master's in, I think, July last year, or June, end of June, beginning of July last year. Details don't really matter, but finished my master's and I was really burnt out. I was in a role that just wasn't suited for me. I was working with parents, and I absolutely loved working with parents and teachers. But the role in the company just wasn't suited for me. And then I actually ended up being made redundant. And so I came out of this redundancy. I was so burnt out. My anxiety levels were so high. I was in a really bad depression kind of stage. And I had said to myself, I'm not doing anything with children. I'm not going anywhere near anything to do with neurodiversity. I'm going into marketing. And I started interviewing at different marketing and research firms. And each interview I did, I was like, oh my goodness, I hate this. I'm not going to be able to do this. Um, so one day I was walking, I think it was along in London, along the Thames, and I was listening to a podcast on ADHD in adults. And I just kept coming back to ADHD, autism, dyslexia, kind of neurodiversity. And I was listening to it in adults, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is me. This is literally me. I've been misdiagnosed pretty much my whole life. And kind of went into a deep hyper focus hole into ADHD in adults, specifically and how it presents in women. And then the next, I think a couple of days later, I woke up, I was like, okay, cool, I'm going to start my own business. And it's going to be helping people navigate the ADHD diagnosis process. I'm going to consult to companies, but I'm only going to work with adults. And kind of a few weeks in, I was like, no, I can't just work with adults. There's such a huge gap for parents. Parents are so unsupported. And I think it almost went back to my childhood and being misdiagnosed, and kind of if my parents had that support, like what would have been different. Um, so yeah, that is a very long-winded answer to how I got to starting my company.
That's
So
not
being
not
made redundant, then saying I'm just working with adults and people like myself, and then being like, no, wait, actually the biggest change that you can have is working with parents, because if they're empowered, then the children will be empowered, and then they don't grow up feeling like they're broken or didn't get the rule book. I always used to say my brain is broken, or not the same as everyone else. And I wish that I grew up believing it's okay to not be the same as everyone else.
not a long-winded answer at all. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And so you got diagnosed with ADHD. I'm curious, what were, I think symptoms is the wrong word. What were your traits? What were your characteristics? What kind of behaviors did you have that caused you to be diagnosed with ADHD?
Yeah. So I have struggled with anxiety and depression pretty much my whole life. I think I came out of the womb anxious. I never slept. I have always been really busy and on the go, but more so in my mind. So like I've been really active in terms of sports, and I think that hid my ADHD traits, if that makes sense, because I'm a combined type ADHD. And I can go and explain that in a little bit, but um, so I think that hyperactivity was kind of masked due to me being so active in sports. But in school and growing up, while being diagnosed with anxiety and depression, I really struggled with emotional regulation. So I'd have these really big emotional outbursts for something seemingly so small. I'd go through like periods of increased burnout or severe burnout, like every 3 months, which is leading to depression and anxiety. I was also kind of away with the fairies. So I was always called the drama queen or the really sensitive one, or that I was in my own world and literally grew up in my own world. So being quite forgetful, but also kind of a hyper ability to hyper focus. Talking really quickly, like I can go, and you probably hear it now. Like if I'm talking too quickly, just raise your hand. And then, yeah, but I think my key thing is emotional regulation. So not being able to regulate those emotions. And then my working memory. So that ability to retain information, short-term information. And I can remember the most random facts, but ask me to remember a name or a movie or like a restaurant. It's never going to happen. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And how helpful has being diagnosed been for you in terms of just like how you manage life since the diagnosis?
Yeah, honestly, it's been huge. It's been, and I want to like caveat this with, and I say this to so many people, is it's been a huge relief to have the understanding and the backdrop as to why I experience things. And I find so like growing up, and I think as you enter into adulthood and as you get older and then starting your own business, there are really small tasks that are meant to be really easy, but they really, I find them really, really difficult. And that is characteristic of ADHD, finding the easy tasks difficult and the hard tasks or the difficult tasks really easy. So in a sense, it's brought a lot of relief because I grew up thinking that I was broken, that I just couldn't handle my emotions. Like last year, I used to say, like, why do I find it so difficult to be an adult? Like, this is not meant to be this difficult. I'm not meant to find these things so difficult. So I grew up feeling I was broken, kind of always going into this cycle of depression and anxiety. I'm like, why can't I pull myself out of this? What is happening? Being quite chaotic and always running late, and my mind just never ever switching off. And my kind of self-talk was always, what is wrong with you? Like, how is this? Like, why can't you just pull yourself out? And I was in and out of therapy constantly and trying different antidepressants and anti-anxieties. And it was just exhausting all the time, literally all the time. Whereas now, I know what is going on. So when I'm experiencing a big emotional reaction, my automatic thought isn't, what's wrong with you? It's like, oh, okay, I know I'm experiencing either rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or I'm just having a big emotion because that's kind of, my brain is wired to have bigger emotions. It's okay, we're going to work ourselves out of it, and we can kind of bring those tools. So it's kind of like that negative self-talk that I did have has been a lot more understanding, and I've been able to be a lot more kind to myself. Running late, being chaotic, I'm like, just fine. We're just going to keep going, and we have that backdrop.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because I think there's a lot of adults that have undiagnosed ADHD, and they're going through things that you went through before you were diagnosed, and they don't have the tools to sort of manage that. So they do think there's a lot of negative self-talk, and they do think that there's something wrong with them, and they don't understand why.
Yeah.
So yeah, and was the process getting tested? Sorry, this is a huge tangent, but I'm just fascinated.
No, I love it.
So the process of getting tested, was that pretty easy to do?
So in the UK, no, it's not easy. I was lucky enough that this had all happened towards the end of the year, and I was going back to South Africa for 8 weeks. So I actually went back to South Africa and I got diagnosed in South Africa. I think it's, in terms of if you're getting diagnosed in South Africa, I would just, especially if you're a woman, I'd make sure that the psychiatrist that is diagnosing is kind of geared up in women, because ADHD can present so differently. Or if you are a guy and you're experiencing your inattentive traits, so that racing mind, and you don't really display the behavioral traits like the hyperactivity and all of that, then I would just say seeing a psychiatrist that has that kind of backdrop is really important, and they don't just look at the behavioral traits. In the UK, it is a nightmare. So if you want to do the NHS, the wait lists are anywhere from a year to 7 years long. You have to go to the GP and explain why you think you have ADHD or how it affects you. And then from there, the GP refers you, and they then refer you. You get put onto a wait list, and eventually, once you're off the wait list, you can go through the process of getting diagnosed. They don't make it easy, and yeah, it's exhausting.
Yeah, sounds exhausting.
No, it
So
is.
back to the business side of things quickly. How have you found the journey so far this last year of running your own business?
Honestly, it's been pretty incredible, not without its really tough days. I think I've woken up a lot being like, I guess that negative self-talk showing up again is like, okay, what are you doing? How are you going to do this? And you find some easy tasks really difficult, like what's going to happen? But I think what I've learned is my resilience has been huge, and my ability to adapt and to just, even if one day I wake up and I'm like, I actually don't know what I'm doing. Why on earth did I decide to do this? The next day I kind of wake up and I'm like, okay, I know why I'm doing this. I can kind of look at sort of towards the bigger picture. And then when I work with my clients, it just makes everything so worth it. I'm like, okay, I know exactly. So they kind of get me through. But it's been a wild year, to say the least. I don't think I've ever worked so hard in my life. And I'm learning so much. So I feel like my brain is constantly at full capacity. So anything from like finance to, because essentially I'm doing everything on my own. It's literally just me. And yeah, so it's been a big learning curve, lots of fun, and lots of days where I'm like, what the actual fuck?
And what would you say, this might be a difficult question to answer, but what would you say has been the hardest part of the journey so far?
Oh, I think that's actually the easiest part to answer. It's probably imposter syndrome. So that waking up and being like, oh my goodness, what gives you the right to do this? Like, what gives you the right to build this business? And kind of why would anyone want to come to you? And kind of beating that negative self-talk. It's taken a lot of work on my behalf to actually pull myself out of that and be like, you're actually just procrastinating because you're scared. And that is like your biggest, that is actually the biggest thing that you need. You need that fear, because that's what essentially pushes you. You need that why. So definitely overcoming imposter syndrome. And then I think also the ADHD side of it, it's kind of navigating the admin. That has been really hard. So trying to stay on top of the admin has been quite difficult. And then probably boundaries, because I'm a very big people pleaser, and I think that's growing up believing that something was wrong with me and that I was different. So I never wanted to seem different. So I'll impulsively say yes to a million things, and then I'm like take a step back, and I'm like, oh no, wait, I actually can't do all of that. So yeah, I think a few things in there.
Yeah, I think a lot of those are very relatable, particularly to an early stage founder.
Yeah.
And how, well, maybe your process has changed now compared to when you began, but how did you go about finding your first clients? What was your approach?
So I actually found my first client in a gym.
Wow.
I think one of my greatest strengths in terms of my business is that my hyper focus is neurodiversity. So it doesn't matter whether I am in a social situation or a networking event, I am always talking about ADHD or autism or dyslexia. And I think people are like, Kate, please, can you keep quiet? Um, but yeah, so I was actually in a boxing gym, and I was boxing with this lady, and she was asking me what I did and what I do. And I was like, I've just started my own company. I help parents, I help children, I help adults. And she was like, oh, my nephew is extreme ADHD and he's really struggling at the moment. Would you like to work with him? And I was like, yes, please. And he was amazing. And I think he set me on a really great trajectory to believing that I could do it. And him and I worked really well together. So that's how I found my first client in a gym. But further from that, I think you can't underestimate networking in person. I love in-person networking. Social media for me can be quite a touch and go place. I get a lot of imposter syndrome from social media, but I do get some clients from social media, but mainly talks, networking, being in person. The gym of all places, we were literally boxing each other.
Yeah, that's a great story. That's like kind of like fate. I mean, you just started your business and you just put it out into the universe and you get a client from that. That's really, really cool.
Exactly. Yeah, that was amazing.
And we touched on this a bit in our initial conversation, where you mentioned that you think the founder's journey might be a bit glamorized. Why do you think it's glamorized?
I think social media, honestly, and honestly, I think, and maybe this is before and after. So like before I started my business, and maybe it was because I was looking into, or it's always been on my algorithm because I've like always followed women who have started businesses and all these things. But I think if you go onto social media, everything that you're going to see around businesses or marketing or social media, it's like, do these 5 steps and you'll make $100,000, or 10 steps to make £1,000,000, or whatever it is. And you need these 3 things to get your LinkedIn strategy and quit your 9 to 5. And I was just like, and I actually, funny enough, before starting my own business, I was like, I believed all of them. And like I did, I bought like a few courses here and there. I was like, okay, well, this is going to help me on my entrepreneurial journey. Don't buy that shit. It doesn't work. And it's absolutely not what being an entrepreneur is like. So yeah, I think social media, it's all about quitting your 9 to 5, working on your own terms, traveling while you're working. Traveling while you're working is awful. It's not as great as it seems, especially if you're on meetings and needing Wi-Fi or good Wi-Fi. It can be amazing, but it's not exactly what social media shows. So yeah, I think if you have an entrepreneurial spirit, it's amazing. It is an amazing journey, but it is absolutely not glamour. There's been months where I'm like, I don't even have enough money to get on a train today, let alone like pay rent. And I think if people are looking constantly 5 steps and you're going to make $100,000, that's probably going to take you 5 years, not 5 steps.
Yes.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've experienced that at all, or kind of what your view on that would be.
Yeah, well, it's, like I don't have my own business per se, so I can't really speak from experience. But in my experience speaking with other people who've done it, like conversations like this, yeah, it's so true, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast was to highlight the difficulties, and also the differences between people who like the idea of being an entrepreneur and actually entrepreneurs who've got out there and done it, and then sharing all the like hardships too, to put things into perspective, that like the idea of being an entrepreneur online isn't all it's hyped up to be, but at the same time, if you really want it, it is attainable, but you've got to work your ass off. And that's kind of the balance that I've learned about in these conversations.
100%. I think that balance, or that kind of knowing that you're going to work so much, and when it's your baby, you never switch off, which can be really, really tricky.
Yeah.
Especially if you've got an ADHD brain, which in itself doesn't switch off. Now you've got a business ADHD brain. Exhausting, to say the least. And you have to give up so much. I at least have incredible friends who understand, but I think sometimes it can be really hard for friends and like relationships as well with an entrepreneur. So I think that isn't glamorized either. You have to give up a lot, either because you can't afford what your friends are affording, or you don't have the time. So it's time and cost too.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
yeah.
And do any important skills come to mind that you think an entrepreneur with ADHD might need?
I think an entrepreneur with ADHD, I think the most important skill would be the ability to ask for help. So us as ADHDers, we have likely grown up believing that we are broken and that something is different, and we don't want to be seen as different. So we've either masked our entire life, or we are complete perfectionists, and we don't want to be seen as different. So asking for help can be really, really challenging. And that's not only as entrepreneurs. I mean, I see it in the children that I work with. I see it in the adults that I work with. Asking for help is probably the key thing that ADHDers struggle with. If you're starting a business and you find easy tasks really difficult, that ability to ask for help is going to be like paramount. So yeah, I think that would be the skill. I think another one would be, and I guess this is a strength of ADHD. So ADHD is likely habit, but resilience, that is huge. That ability to know to not give up, because I guess we do have a dysregulation in dopamine. So we're always seeking that reward. And in entrepreneurship, that reward may not come, or it may come and it's like you having to navigate burnout. So yeah, our kind of resilience and that ability to adapt quickly, and just get up again. If it fails, you just get up. And then knowing when something is like rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So rejection sensitivity dysphoria is kind of what neurodivergent individuals. So it's mainly the research is focused on ADHD, but it means that we have this tendency to have extreme emotional reactions to any perceived rejection, criticism, negative feedback. So that ability to kind of know when you're experiencing that versus not experiencing RSD, I think is really important. I don't know if that makes sense at all, because I just threw a brand new term to you,
No,
briefly explained it.
it does. It does. Yeah, but what I also find interesting is, like, on the other side, people also almost self-diagnose themselves
Yeah.
with ADHD sometimes, or they like to think that they have it to sort of excuse some behavior or traits. Like when you were speaking there, like what came to mind was, for me, was like I have a fear of failure in some aspects of my life. But so when you're talking, I can almost like put myself in an ADHD box in a way where I'm like, oh, maybe I do have it. And then it's like, oh, then that makes it more excusable at times, and like things like that. So this is just coming off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
that was a thought while you're speaking, and I'm fascinated as to why. Do you see that often, where some people might think that they do have it, but they actually don't have it?
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't be able to diagnose, so you need to go to a psychiatrist to diagnose. But from what you're saying there, and it's conversations that I have so often, is first of all, and I think I have a social media post coming out about this week, but having ADHD is not an excuse for behavior. So even if like I have a client or anyone and they say, oh yeah, I did this because I have ADHD, like it still means you have consequences. Like it just doesn't excuse behavior, but it is a starting point for understanding, and then you know exactly what strategies and support tools you can put into place. It's not going to be perfect all the time, but at least you know you have a starting point and it brings understanding. So that's number one. Then number two, from what you said, is ADHD traits, as well as autistic traits, as well as dyslexic traits, are really relatable. So I experience it a lot, in the sense that people will say, because if I have an overthinking brain, my brain is hyperactive. So people say, yeah, but everyone overthinks and everyone forgets where their keys are, and everyone forgets or has a meltdown or has big emotions to some events. Um, and everyone struggles to do like daily tasks like unpacking the dishwasher or remembering to shower or whatever it is. Um, so I always say yes, but ADHD would affect your ability to function every day. So yes, you may overthink from time to time, but does it affect your ability to get out of bed in the morning, or to actually put a social media post out, or to finish a task? Or does your emotional dysregulation lead you to break down in the middle of an airport, or in the middle of a overloaded, crowded environment or networking? Um, does that make sense? So like it affects your everyday functioning. Um, if you forget tasks, is it here and there, or is it like affecting your ability to run your business, or remember dates that your friends tell you, or things that your friends tell you? So that's the key difference. Is yes, very relatable, but where ADHD comes in is it affects your everyday functioning, and it has to be consistent across settings. So, for example, for me, I have ADHD traits at home, I have them out in the community, I have them at work. Those are 3 settings. Whereas, and then a child as well, does it show up in school? Does it show up at home? Does it show up in the community? And that's kind of how you would begin to assess whether it's ADHD or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you were describing those sort of behaviors, like breaking down in the airport and not being able to get out of bed, before that behavior is diagnosed, I can imagine that it's really difficult as like a parent or even someone close to that person to fully understand how to deal with the person in those states, how to manage it. And I'm sure that's where you come in.
Yeah.
So how do how do you approach parents, and how do you chat to them, and what is the process of like getting parents or close family members to understand what that child is going through?
Yeah. So that is such a great question. And it's pretty much the starting point of any of my coaching sessions or packages or anything that I do. And it doesn't matter if it's a parent or if it's an adult experiencing it, but we'll always start with understanding. So understanding exactly what ADHD is, what is going on in your brain, or what understanding what autism is, what is going on in your brain. And then we would start to pick out challenges, and then we would start to pick out strengths, and then I'd relate that back to ADHD, and say, okay, well, this is likely an ADHD trait. This is likely an ADHD trait. This is a strength. This is a challenge. Not that they go together, but we'll look at them and we almost like dissect. So we become kind of like detectives to find out and understand exactly what is going on in the brain. Once we have that understanding of what is going on in the brain, I'll look at how people, or so if it's a parent, I'll kind of look and see how are you reacting to these different situations. Because children are always going to match your energies. How are you speaking to them? How are you speaking to yourself? And then kind of moving away from especially if a child has been diagnosed, or you as an adult has been diagnosed, you're reading reports that are really, they look at deficits. So they see differences as deficits, like this child is lacking attention, or this child is lacking this. So I go and I break that down completely, and we look at it from a strengths perspective, and then kind of look at the whole holistic environment. What's going on in school, what's going on in work, what's going on at home, how are you talking to yourself, how are you taking care of yourself as a parent, and then how are you taking care of the child too. um, yeah, that's a lot, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And well, I noticed there, I'm assuming you're obviously very careful and strategic with like the language you use, particularly with children, because you said strength, and then strength, so you didn't use the opposite word, weaknesses, you used challenges. So as to not to frame it in like a negative light, I assume.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find that so interesting because children are so easily influenced and they take everything in. And what kind of changes do you see? Like, how receptive are parents? Is it common that everyone just wants to help, or do some not believe that their child has ADHD and they're against it? Or like, what's the general consensus, and like what happens after you've
Yeah.
done working with them?
So usually when parents come to me, they've come to me because they know that, or either that their child is having challenges and that something could be going on, or they're about to get a diagnosis, and they're waiting to go through the process, or they're looking to get a diagnosis, or they've been diagnosed already. So I'm coming from the perspective where parents are really wanting help, and they are wanting that understanding. So all the parents that I've worked with have been really incredible. I think sometimes where it can become a little bit difficult is where we're looking at everyone's behaviors, and we're never blaming anyone. Like, everyone is here to learn, but it can be quite tricky to navigate someone coming in and saying, okay, well, these parenting methods may not be working, but here are some others that we can use. I'm not judging you, and we're going to work together. So I love that everything is so collaborative. What I usually see with my parents is that they gain confidence. So I always say, so I'm a coach first, a consultant second. So a coach comes in and it's a collaborative process. I'm not going to fix anything for you, but I'm going to help you find the way. Whereas a consultant comes in and they say, okay, what's your problem? I'm going to solve it. So I do like a little bit of back and forth. So I like guide parents to find solutions themselves, and then I'll help them with extra tools. So if we're needing like a visual schedule, if they're really struggling with a routine, how can we put that in place? And then I help navigate that. So I think the most that I see is that parents walk away really confident in being able to advocate for their child, but also understanding their child. And then a lot of the parents that I work with also get diagnosed themselves or self-diagnose themselves, and they're like, I actually struggled with this too when I was growing up. And it's hereditary, so a lot of the time it does run in the family. But then I see the parents understanding themselves more too, which is amazing. And then I think some of my best work is with the children who then start believing in themselves. I mean, I had a client the other day that said to me, we were talking about going into school, and she finds it really difficult to go into school because it's really overwhelming. And she watched a little boy run in ahead of her, and she's like, I wish I was the same. He finds it so easy. But don't worry, my brain's just a little bit different, and it's okay. We're going to put the support tools in place to get there. And I was like, fuck, like, walk away. Don't let me see you crying. But just seeing children then believe in themselves and be like, oh, I relate. That's like, I've got a different brain. Nothing's wrong with it. That's the whole goal.
That's amazing. Yeah, that must feel great, like feeling like you're making a difference, and you can see it's like a tangible difference in people's lives.
Yeah, that is amazing. Unselfishly, it's like almost it's therapeutic for me too.
Yeah,
like,
I get that.
Yeah,
it's like these conversations for me. It's like I get to learn a lot from people, and like this is a conversation where I'm genuinely just exploring my curiosity. It's like,
yeah,
it's great.
What life's all about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And when you work with schools, what's that like? Is it working with particular children who have ADHD and other are they, what would you call them? I didn't want to say issues is a negative word. What would you say? Is it learning differences?
Yeah, so they can have learning differences. So a lot of the language, and I mean, you are so like, and I always say this to any school or company that I work with, I'm like, we're all here to learn. So don't be afraid to say the wrong thing, because that means that we can learn. I'm going to say the wrong thing at a point, you may, but we're here to learn, because essentially it's a new topic and not many people talk about it, especially in South Africa, but then also it's new in the UK, but still not known enough. So I would say don't be afraid to get it wrong. But I think we are changing, or I at least am trying to change the terminology to differences rather than like disabilities or disorders or things like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then, okay, your question was,
how do you work with schools?
Thank you. Yeah. Navigating my ADHD brain. So with schools, what I do is I usually offer free talks to schools, mainly for parents. I'll offer free talks for schools for parents for like neurodiversity awareness, or if the school wants a specific topic, so I can go in and just talk about ADHD or just talk about autism, or just, I don't usually talk about dyslexia on its own, but I usually do neurodiversity as a whole or do something more bespoke. And that will be free for schools. With teachers, I would go in and work. Usually, what I'll do is I'm actually working with the child at home and their parents, and then I go into the school. And while I'm there, I'm looking at the environment, I'm looking at the teacher, and looking at like how everything is kind of conducive to the child, and making sure that environment is the same of what we're working on at home. If they need any support tools or strategies in place, I'll make sure that they're in place in school too. So that's how, and it can be tricky to navigate because obviously, as a teacher, and then someone else is coming in as a kind of like a private consultant and say, hey, like you've been teaching this way for years, can you change it
Yeah.
up for this one or just for one child? And I do get a little bit of like um, backlash from teachers, or kind of they don't really listen to me and they're like, oh, I've tried it. So I'm like, yeah, have you tried it consistently though? um, so yeah, that can be difficult to navigate. Also because teachers don't, and I mean, I say this with a caveat as well, because I've worked with some really incredible teachers who are there to learn and they're just so happy to learn. But teachers are overworked and they're not trained in kind of neurodiversity. So it can be a tricky one. I'd like to get into more trainings with schools, and going in and kind of training teachers. So yeah, that is definitely on the cards and something that I'll do in the future.
Cool. Yeah, I can imagine it being difficult for some teachers. There's also like a pride and ego thing, and it's like someone coming in and telling me how to teach and run my class.
Literally.
So yeah, it must be an interesting thing to navigate. So as you touched on a bit in your previous answer, that like people are starting to notice a bit more, even though it's quite a slow change. But why do you think people are starting to pay attention? Well, late might be the wrong word, but like only now, because I mean, ADHD and this type of neurodiversity has been around for possibly ever, but we're only really now diagnosing it and understanding it. Why do you think it took so long?
It's a great question. So ADHD has been around, I think, in the first literature, and I'm probably going to get the date wrong, so maybe I shouldn't get the date or say the date, but like early to mid 19. What is it? What are we in the 21st century?
Yeah.
20th century. So
So
like 100
1950s.
years. ADHD has been around for about 100 years. Or in the literature, it's been around for about 100 years. But mainly ADHD and autism have been kind of the diagnostic criteria has been set up to mimic white 8-year-old boys. So like, for example, in an autism assessment in the DSM-5, one question is, do they line up dinosaurs and trains, and or have a special interest in dinosaurs and trains? Like that would probably only relate to a small number of like children, specifically boys. But I mean, that you could, already in that one question, you're canceling out a huge population. So it was very much focused on white boys because they were part of the clinical trials. They were able to access healthcare. And then also focused on behavioral traits, and no one really focused on what is going on inside. So, like, for example, with ADHD, you have the inattentive type where you display no behavioral symptoms except for maybe emotional dysregulation. In the UK, adults were only able to be diagnosed with ADHD from 2008. So that is not even in the last 20 years. Neurodiversity as a whole was only coined 20 years ago. So those are like really small numbers if you think about it.
Yeah.
And they thought that originally ADHD was only a child kind of, and they called it disorder. So child disorder, or that is present only in children and not in adults. So children essentially outgrew it, which is false. You can't outgrow it. If you're born with ADHD, you are born with ADHD. Your symptoms and all your traits change over time. Same with autism, they change over time. But you will always be autistic, or you will always be ADHD. You can't cure it, you can't treat it. Same with dyslexia. Dyslexia was only thought to affect children and wasn't thought to affect adults. I think COVID shined a huge light on everything, because all of a sudden people couldn't go into work and they had to find different ways of working and adapting. And for your neurodivergent individuals, it was a really probably mostly great thing for them, because there's no traveling and you can work from home and kind of choose your own environment. So I think COVID kind of kickstarted that a little bit more, even though that it was starting to come out before then. I think COVID kind of accelerated it. And then, yeah, I think it's just people have kind of the diagnostic criteria is being set up or kind of being researched and adapted. But also people are realizing that there isn't just one way of processing, and that there isn't just a normal. As everyone says, there isn't just one society and we shouldn't be fitting in. And that's okay that there's differences. And I think people are more aware and more kind of open to talking about it. Whereas I think in previous generations, you were likely to hide it and hide your difficulties and hide your mental health. Yeah, I think people are just more open, wanting a difference, because as you said, suicide rates, it's crazy out there. The more we kind of bring awareness, the more change we can have, which is huge.
Yeah, I agree. And is there anything we haven't necessarily touched on that you think is important for people to understand about ADHD?
I mean, I think everything is important. I could carry on talking about ADHD forever, really. But I
Sorry,
think the most
sorry, I'll just interrupt there. I say ADHD, and I don't know why I'm only talking about ADHD. I actually mean all neurodivergent.
yeah, no, and that's I guess I could talk about it all forever.
Yeah.
So bring it on. No, I'm kidding. I think one thing that I'd want people to know is that whatever you think ADHD or autism or dyslexia looks like, it's absolutely not like that. And it's so unique to every human. And I think we are brought up with such stereotypes, and we like placing people into boxes. So if you have ADHD, a lot of people think of a naughty boy who runs up and down or has this boundless energy, or like a chaotic person that can't do anything or is always getting in trouble. Or if you think of autism, you think of like the Sheldon Coopers of the world, or you think that they're only interested in one thing, or that they don't have any empathy or can't interact socially. And then you think of dyslexics and you think that person can't read and can't spell. Like, it's all just these stereotypes. So I would challenge anyone to check your stereotypes, and to not to say to someone, if they tell you their diagnosis, you don't look ADHD or you don't look autistic, because I will always say, and I hope everyone says to them, okay, cool, what does autistic look like? Or what does ADHD look like? So it's almost taking your stereotypes and throwing them out the window, because there isn't one way of the world, and there isn't one way that ADHD, autism, dyslexia looks. And then I think just noticing your environment is really important. How we're speaking, noises, like kind of how we talk to anyone is just huge.
Yeah, great. And you touched on earlier when I asked the question about, strengths and challenges. So I'm curious, can ADHD or all other neurodivergent, how shall I refer to them? Traits? Neurodivergent
Right? Yeah, that's good.
traits. Can they be superpowers? Like, how can they show themselves as strengths, or what sort of traits are strengths? When you've been diagnosed with them.
Yeah. So again, it's so unique to every person, and each person is going to see their own traits as so different. So some people will call it a superpower. Other people will say that saying it is that it's a superpower leads to their challenges being like discredited, or how difficult it actually is to be neurodivergent in a neurotypical world. and it's just kind of down to the one person. I think for me, I do see a lot of my strengths as, I don't know if I'd call them, go so far to say as superpowers, but I think without them, I wouldn't be what I'm doing today. I wish I'd had the understanding sooner, because I'm like, geez, imagine if this world had this Kate years ago. I'd be unstoppable, and I will be unstoppable. So in that sense, yes. I think some key strengths that we look at is, and these are just very common neurodivergent strengths, and they're going to be unique to everyone. But that ability to hyper-focus, so hyper-focus on your special interests, and get an insane amount of work done, that is a key strength. Resilience and adaptability, because you're growing up in a world that's not set up for you. You're existing in a world that's not set up for you, and you continue to do so. Problem solving, like high attention to detail, visual thinking, like creative, out the box. Because again, we're growing up in worlds that are not set up for us, so we need to be completely creative to exist, essentially. And ADHD is that risk taking and high energy. Those are all seen as strengths, but at the same breath, they can also be seen as challenges. So hyper focusing for me, while it's a really big strength, it's also a challenge, because it leads me to burn out faster, and I can forget to eat, I can forget to sleep, I can forget that I actually need to go to the toilet, like out of all things, like because you just are not aware, or have that self-awareness. But high attention to detail, like seeing things that other people don't see, it's just all those kind of strengths. So yes, I think, and this is kind of the work that I do, when if I'm going into an organization, or if I'm going into a home or a school, is as long as we have the right environment. So if someone struggles sensory, like, do we have something that can accommodate that? If that person or that individual is in the right environment, oh my goodness, they're going to be unstoppable. And so it's so important to just know the strengths, know the challenges, and then adjust your environment accordingly, and you'll see everyone shine. Still have challenges, because again, we're growing up in a neurotypical world that's not set up for us, but those strengths will really shine, which is amazing.
Yeah, that is amazing. And what's the long-term goal for your business? Where do you see it in 5 years?
Good question. um to be honest, and I've actually been doing a lot of work on this in the last few months, because I think I've really seen a change in like the direction of my business. And maybe it's because when I decided I was starting a business, I actually didn't really know what to expect or what was going to happen. I was just like, cool, we're starting a business, let's jump in deep. But I think my main goal and long-term goal is to help as many people as possible. If I can help one person, that's amazing. But I want to see how far reaching I can get. I kind of think, and this is a very ambitious goal, but in 15 years, I don't want neurodiversity to be a topic. I want it to be so ingrained in society that people don't need someone like me to go in and say, your environment's not inclusive. I want every environment to be as inclusive as possible. And that may sound so unrealistic and so unachievable, but if I can start with one person or one organization and just work my way up like that, there's an incredible neurodiversity kind of community. So if we can work together to make sure in 15 years it's not even a topic of conversation, that is probably my goal, as ambitious and far-reaching as it is. If maybe we're paring back down someone to help me with the admin.
That's really, really cool. And I think it's important to have that sort of vision. It's something to work towards, and I believe you'll achieve it.
I hope so.
Before I end every conversation, I ask my guests if they have a question for me.
Yes. This is so exciting. I think my question for you is probably, what is your best thing that you've learned from starting this podcast? And I think I know you've done I think you hit 52 a couple of months ago, and that was your goal, was to do one a week. But what is your best learning that you've learned on this journey of creating a podcast?
So there's two learnings. One's about myself and one's sort of about the external world from having conversations with entrepreneurs and founders. The one about myself is that I've proven to myself that I have the ability to like stick to something and get it done. And I think that's been a process for, I don't know, 5 years now. Where I'd started with like incremental things, like I wrote a blog for a while. I took photos 3 times a week, every week for like half a year or maybe even a year. And so it was doing things like that where I set the goal. There was no one else holding me accountable. And so it enabled me to know that I could do the podcast thing. But when you're posting publicly, there's like, it feels like there's someone else holding you accountable, even at the beginning when no one's really watching. And so I think I've just proven to myself that like I have the resilience and I can do it. And so whatever project I pick, like I want to be an entrepreneur and start businesses, like I know I can grind it out and stick with it. And the good things come to people who stick with things long term. They don't happen overnight, which is something that I've learned from speaking to entrepreneurs. And then on the entrepreneur side is that like, I've learned a lot about like how the idea doesn't need to be the most amazing idea in the world. It doesn't need to be pretty or fancy. It's just these people got started, they gave it a go, and they stuck with it. And that's just all it really takes. Although that is simplifying entrepreneurship down, and many would say there's lots of nuances, but at the beginning stage, which is what my podcast is focused on, like you have to be willing to get started, face rejection, and keep going. And if you stick with it, like I'm sure it was really tough at the beginning for you, and a year later, you've now bearing the fruits of that hard work. But at the beginning, a lot of people probably would have given up and been like, actually, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm going to find a job because this is too scary and too difficult, and I can't afford a train ticket right now. Screw that. I don't want to deal with that. So that's the trait of entrepreneurs, and combining the like perseverance of the podcast with like me understanding what it takes to be an entrepreneur, I think has equipped me with like the tools to do so, which I've really
so
benefited.
Essentially, the podcast was like your test run to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, in a way, it was like work on a project that is probably not going to bear fruit. It probably won't earn money. And it could earn money because having this catalog of 60 odd episodes is a great thing for if it gets discovered by enough people. But I'm not banking on that. It's more these conversations I'm learning. Like I learned a lot about neurodivergence today, and that's a win. That's an hour well spent. And so it's framing it like that, but having the catalog of all these conversations opens up the opportunity for something to possibly happen because I put in the work. So the intention was never to monetize, but this was just an idea that I wanted to do, a project that I wanted to do that could possibly become a business, but it wasn't like the business that I wanted to start. But I'm really enjoying it. I'm really glad I did it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think so inspiring as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you're inspiring too. I mean, you just suck your head down and did it, and you're making a real difference, an impact, and really important impact.
Yeah, thank you. And so are you, because you're making entrepreneurs feel less alone. Because it's a lonely spot. And you're in the mud half the time. And a lot of the time on your own, especially if you're a sole founder. So it is. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And well, thank you for joining me, Kate. I really appreciate it. If people want to find out more about you and your business, where can they do so?
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. It's been amazing. And people can find me. My business name is the ever creative Kate La Trobe. So it is my name. So I've got a website, and then I'm also on Instagram. I'm Neurodivergent with KLT. as well as LinkedIn. So those are kind of my 3 platforms that people can get in touch with. There's an email address on all 3 of them, as well as a phone number that they can get in touch with me if they want to share some insights, ask some questions, or even just tell me what content they want to see. I'm always open for that.
Awesome. Thanks again, Kate. Chat soon.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening. I really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the episode. One more quick reminder before you go. I have a weekly newsletter by the same name, Another Excuse, where I cover 4 topics: something that has changed my perception, a tool that could be useful to you, content that is actually worth consuming, and a concept that I try break down and explain. If this sounds of any interest to you and you need a kick up the arse, then you can subscribe at the link below. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next week.